I want to go to this particular question because it talks about who is the domestic population. So, question from Matthew Taylor. Thank you, Matthew. How much confidence do you have that the domestic population can effectively inform foreign policy, especially in light of recent domestic events?
Well, that is cause for concern. January 6th changed, I think, how a lot of us think about the U.S. at home and abroad. I'd start looking outward in. I think, as the questioner knows, the world community looked to the U.S. and saw January 6th as a kind of symbolic moment of fracture in American society. Domestic politics and foreign policy would suggest that there's a group of Americans who are not committed to democracy, not committed to the rule of law in the way that it has traditionally been understood, or at least in the recent past. So yes, one should have doubts. The way that those of us who are experts on U.S. foreign relations and U.S. foreign relations history think about this is very often foreign policy has been the domain of elites, as we were noting earlier. The American population, when polled, surveyed, and tested, knows very little about foreign policy, is notoriously bad going back through all of U.S. history on, say, finding other countries on the map or naming world leaders. This has been lamented in every generation. It's a simple fact of American history, and the U.S. largely the argument is by dint of geography, hasn't had to cultivate, say, multilinguistic skills, doesn't travel as much to other nations. If you're in Central Europe, you can't avoid other languages moving around, right? You absolutely can avoid that in the U.S. And there have been politicians for generations who've said that they don't care much about having passports or traveling abroad. America is where everything is, et cetera. I don't need to rehearse that story. We all know it, right? So, but that doesn't mean that the wider population doesn't have beliefs about core values for foreign policy, or what Mel Leffler often talks about, a historian of foreign relations. In the core values, vital interests of the nation. And so, thinking about those, that's something that Donald Trump tapped into very clearly with his rhetoric. That and this is something I've written a lot about as well, about isolationism and nationalism. That he made an effective argument that by focusing singularly on the interests of Americans, that would be a better outcome for the nation as a whole, that the nation was being duped into kinds of deals abroad, that the longstanding commitments of troops in other places, which again haven't been very popular since roughly 2006, 2008, so certainly at the end of the Bush years, but also in the 90s. You can think about Clinton's wariness to put boots on the ground in Kosovo. You can think about there were more interventions in the Clinton years than in virtually any other presidencies, but they were much lower scale. So the goal was to have fewer deaths and to achieve U.S. ends through other means, including military means, but certainly not limited to them. He mostly wanted to do economic policies. So all of which is a way of wrapping our minds around the fact that Americans do have beliefs, core values, and that Donald Trump was able to tap into them. And that's what Biden is trying to do with this middle class effort. If you look to the history, there's a great chapter in our book by Michaela Honecker Moore, which looks at grassroots foreign policy. Foreign policy begins at home. She argues that phrase comes out from is a book published by an advisor to FDR in November 1944. It's James Warburg, who looking at how U.S. commitments might unfold after the war, was suggesting that the U.S. needed to take a world leadership role, prevent future Holocausts, for instance, but also he feared a kind of inward turn of nationalism. Okay, we've done this. The U.S. has accomplished this. Now stop. One of the things that Michaela Honecker Moore finds is that U.S. GIs coming out of their war experience also had very similar thoughts. Yes, the U.S. should be committed abroad, but they were very reluctant to have U.S. troops committed abroad. So they had a much more, you might call, soft power approach. GIs wrote to their representatives. They were very engaged in these questions. They may not have known quite as much, or they may have known more than the average American about the world. We could quibble with that level of knowledge. But the point being that they really had firm beliefs about the US's proper foreign policy or even grand strategy in the early Cold War. And you can find this in the historical record elsewhere. We just tend to ignore it a bit. And this is Nick's initial point. Americans care about foreign policy. Americans may not know that much about the world, as I noted, but they do care. And so finding ways to connect with them, and this is what will be the big challenge for Biden, and then educate them somewhat on some of the issues that they maybe don't know about, particular regions or ethnic groups in other countries that need support. What's going on in Myanmar? Why they should care about different groups in China and human rights violations, for instance, or what that says about production of different technologies. That's an educative opportunity for an administration, for people who already have kinds of core values and commitments. So I have some optimism that there's a broader swath of people beyond the January 6th folks who care about foreign policy, care about the US's role in the world. And just back to Tatiana's earlier point, when you look at this Pew polling, Americans are on the other end now of the mind your own business in the world moment. So that was happening in the late 2000s or around 2010. Americans wanted to withdraw more. Now we're looking at the other end of that. The Americans seem to want the US to be doing more in the world and be more assertive in a variety of ways, mostly cultural and commercial, not military. And so those commitments, I think, can be built on by this administration or by another.